Mark here, another great Mark 2.0. Gordon's up in Ontario, Canada. We got an iconic guest for you today. One of my eighth grade teachers, Jennifer Jowett, who also wrote this remarkable fictional novel called Into the Shadows. Now, Jennifer, I'd like to have you start by explaining what was your inspiration behind writing Into the Shadows?
I've always loved historical fiction, and a very good friend of ours, her mother, this is the story that is that brought a lot of the elements of the story into this book. And so she had talked on different occasions about things that had happened to her, and it was just fascinating to listen to her. So I just explored that more and wanted to tell that story.
Oh, that's great. And it's self-published, right?
It is. It's independently published. Yes.
Now, why did you decide to go that route?
I do editing for my uncle, who also writes and does independent publishing. He does the Max Blake series, and he was reading through this and really encouraged me to do something with it. I don't think I would have had he not been sort of the impetus behind that. And so it seemed a bit overwhelming. And there was also a sort of back and forth about, should I try to get this published with a publishing house, or should I just do this independently? And then some life events happened, and I was like, let's just do this. And so we did. And he kind of guided me through the process. It went much more quickly than I thought. From what I know about publishing, it's usually about 2 years before your book ends up actually out in the world. And so I, in the back of my head, was expecting that this was going to take quite a bit of time, and it did not. It kind of was like, oh, it's live and now it's happening. And so, yeah, it just kind of happened.
And most of the authors that Gordon and I know, they're self-publishing. So this has become, the norm nowadays. Gordon, what would you like to ask?
Well, I was interested in knowing, now we're talking to Jennifer Jowett.
Yes, Jowett, yep.
Or conversely, Jennifer Guyor Jowett.
Correct.
And I was wondering if the decision to publish under three names, were you channeling your inner Louisa May Alcott?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I had done some writing under my maiden name, which was Guyor. And so I wanted to include that. It's a big part of my identity. And so I just wanted to have that be part of the name. So.
Okay. And you've tackled, you said you like historical fiction. I read a lot of Gore Vidal, Michael Harris, and I enjoy historical fiction. And boy, oh boy, did you pick a region of the world with such an enormous history of conflict, war, the former Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to set did you have the story and you inserted it into that time, or did you want a story in that time, in that place?
Oh, I wanted it in that time and place. So I wanted it to be as authentic as possible. So the family friend, that is where her family is from, and she escaped from Slovenia just after the war ended. And it's not an area that is explored a lot in middle grade fiction. I've read lots of World War II. Students are always interested in World War II books, and most of them are set in Germany or France, but specifically Germany. And so there's a couple of writers who are doing things outside of the Western European area. Rudis Apetis has done some things with Eastern Europe, and Alan Gratz has done some things with Japan. And so I felt it was an area that really hadn't been told before, and definitely wanted to tell it. And Yugoslavia, I believe, is the only country that was divided by 4 invading factions. So they had Germany coming in from the north, the Italians, the Hungarians, and then the Kingdom of Croatia is the 4th one. And so they were split lots of ways. And on top of that, they had the resistance, the Partizani, who were fighting against them. And that also created problems within the country itself, because some people were siding with them. That eventually became a communist. It was, communist. And then some people were fighting against them as well. And so there was just a lot going on. I also wanted to make sure that people understood that it doesn't matter where you're from, people are people. So you're going to have good people and you're going to have bad people within that same place. And so some of the stories that our family friend told us that made it into the book, I'm hopefully showing that. There was a situation where she encountered a German soldier and that German soldier assisted her. And, that wasn't a Nazi soldier. I can't say that the Nazis ever would have been good at all, but to see that there were just people who were fighting for their country who may not have been totally in support of what their country was doing and had gotten drafted into it or whatever, or who still cared about other people, I think is important too. So I wanted to show that there was just a lot of nuances in each of the countries, and that you can't automatically think of somebody as being bad just because of the country that they're from. The government might be one thing, but the people who are within that country aren't necessarily the same. So
very good. Yugoslavia, we have to say the former Yugoslavia. I'm not even, there's Bosnia and Herzegovina, there's Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia. It's 5 or 6. Montenegro comes in there. There's 5 or 6 countries that it eventually morphed into after Tito.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Slovenia ended up being one of the countries that was the most successful at transitioning into a democracy. And again, my knowledge of this is somewhat limited, so I'm not purporting to be an expert at all, but it just was fascinating to read all of the different stories of what happened to the people who were there and how they fought against the invading forces that came against them. So yeah, I wanted students to be able to read about an area that they wouldn't necessarily have been familiar with other than, through a middle grade fiction book. So it's not usually covered in history books extensively.
Changing gears, I want to throw a question over to Mark.
Sure, go for it.
Interviewing the interviewer. And I want to ask, I want to remark that I can tell why this teacher, this educator, made such an impression on you, because man, oh man, the passion you have bleeds through the internet.
Yeah,
Thank you.
exactly.
How long ago were you Ms. Jowett?
Mrs. Jowett, yeah. Boy, Mark, how long has it been? I
think I got my yearbook in the mail from my mom. It was like 94, 95, I think it was.
Okay.
Either 93, 94, 94, 95. And she wrote the nicest comment. It was like, have fun, enjoy. She said something real. I'll have to get it afterwards and recite it to you, but enjoy high school. And it was and one thing about your class is I remember that you let us, be really creative in our writing. I remember doing a project, or I should say an assignment, where I wrote about loss of innocence, and it was about an episode of Silver Spoons. It was unreal. I mean, there was no, and what was great about your class is, and I really didn't get it my freshman and sophomore year in high school until I transferred over to East Kentwood, and it just was able to get my creative writing on. Like when I moved over to East Kentwood, Gordon's gonna laugh at this. I wrote an article on an assignment on, I think it was Macbeth, comparing Macbeth to Bobby Knight. And my aunt, who was a high school teacher, loved it. She's from Southern Indiana. My aunt loved it. So, and Gordon can attest that my writing continues to excel, because that's how I get these guests on the podcast, is by writing these elaborate emails.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, that's great to hear. I'm glad. And creative writing has always been really important to me. So I enjoy teaching that and reading what kids write much more than I do expository writing, which is not as fun to look at.
Now, how many years have you been teaching?
I started teaching in 1989. So it's been a long time. Yeah. So you're way back at the early end of everything. So I'm glad I was having an impact back then, because I don't think teachers until you run into somebody that you formally taught, I don't think you truly know if you're making an impact or not, because you're sort of living in that moment, and it's harder to see kids' growth in a 9-month period than it is, once they're well down the line. So anyway, that's great to hear. I'm excited about that.
Were you always teaching 8th grade? Because you're teaching 8th grade right now, right?
Yeah, remarkably enough, they placed me into middle school, and that's not what I had thought I was going to be doing. I am secondary certified, so I expected to be teaching high school or college, and all of my student teaching experiences were middle school. I'm like, why are they putting me in middle school? I want high school. And then I realized how much I loved it, and I just stayed with it. And you would have to love it. I don't think you'd survive it otherwise, because it's just a chaotic kind of wild time for kids. And so right now I'm actually doing just 7th graders. That happened with COVID a couple of years ago. I used to do, at the school I'm at now, I was doing 8th grade English and 7th grade Lit. And when COVID started to happen, my teaching partner, who did the opposite of me, she did 7th grade English and 8th grade Lit. She and I talked, and we went, well, we can minimize the number of kids that are getting exposed to teachers and that kind of thing if we just teach the one grade. And so we split it up. And so now I'm just doing 7th grade, which I absolutely love. They're such a fun group.
Sure. And how long were you at IHM? You weren't there that long, were you?
Boy, I want to say it was about 10 years.
Oh, wow. Okay. Never mind then. Yeah.
Yeah.
I could be there a while.
Yeah, I could be wrong on that, but that feels about right to me. It might have been a little bit less than that.
And you're originally from the other side of the state, right?
I'm from the east side of the state, yes. And then I went to Aquinas College, which took me to the west side of the state, and fell in love with the Grand Rapids area and got a job there, and stayed there for the longest time, and then eventually moved to Lansing and have been here for probably 13 or 14 years now. So
yeah, and I apologize to the Lansing listeners for wearing a Michigan
totally
shirt.
fine.
I'm representing the state. So
no, that's okay. I got it.
It's
been great connecting with students. So one of the things I wanted to do with this was incorporate students into this process as much as possible. So I reached out to a former student who had graduated from college and was in the art field, had gone to Kendall in Grand Rapids, and had him do the cover for the book. And so I love being able to have this connection back to students. It's been a lot of fun.
Oh, it's great. And you can attest that, Grand Rapids has grown into this very diverse culture. Look at things like Art Prize, It's unreal.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a great city, very vibrant.
Gordon, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, going on a different tack, hearing Lansing, I'm just wondering if you ever ran into Irving Magic Johnson.
I have not, not like personally run into him. No, but you had mentioned Bobby Knight, and that takes me back to my sister who worked and still does work for Isaiah Thomas. So we have that connection to Michigan, and Bobby Knight. It's
funny too. You're going to laugh at this because I, met a guy online who used to work for, I think, Fox 2. He worked for a couple radio also in Detroit, Mark Wilson. And I just found one of his posts on Bill Lambier, because we were trying to get Bill Lambier on the podcast, and he added me as a friend. We've been chatting. He suggested that I reach out to the Las Vegas Aces, because that's the last place he worked at. Well, the Las Vegas Aces did me a favor and reached out to him, but Bill just doesn't like to do interviews. So understandably, but it's amazing what we've been able to accomplish with this podcast. So.
Yeah, I was looking through your past guests, and you have a huge diversity, which is awesome.
And that's what we're trying to, achieve.
We're trying to be eclectic.
Yes, I
And
noticed your sign said you're looking for the ultimate truths. So I want to ask what ultimate truths you have both found.
Oh, that was Gordon's idea. What do you think?
Oh yeah, put it on me.
Yeah.
I'll put it down to hyperbolic writing, but ultimately truth is existential. So everyone's, sharing their truths. Now, one of the truths I heard you talking about was the fact that you absolutely love middle school, which shocks me every time I meet someone teaching grades 7 and 8, especially those two, because of, preteen, tween, whatever you want to call them. I remember my time being 12, 13 years old in grade 7 and 8, and what we put our teachers through. God bless you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I have students who come up to me and they're like, I'm so sorry for the way I was. And it's like, I get it. It's not what I would have thought. Like the middle school years were not my favorite years in school. And
they're nobody's favorite years in school.
Probably not.
Nobody's.
Yeah, I don't know what draws me to them. I know that they're they're still very malleable and they're super inquisitive. And I love that about them. They don't have sort of the jaded sense that I think high school students get. And so they're quirky and they're just completely themselves. And I adore that. I learned so much from them all of the time. And honestly, having to teach through COVID for the last 2 years, if it wasn't for the students, I don't know that I would have made it, because the challenges with teaching were so immense, but the kids were the kids no matter what. And they just wanted to be there. And they embraced it and they went with it. And, I think that's what middle school kids do all the time. So yeah, they're fun.
One thing that I remember too, and I don't know if I doubt if you remember this, is Gordon at IHM, we would have Immaculate Heart of Mary. We would have this picnic day or whatever it was at the end of the year. Well, I'm pretty sure it was 8th grade. It was either 7th or 8th grade. I'm pretty sure it was 8th grade though. There was a time when we went outside in front of the church and we were doing something outside. Well, I would say about 80% of the students rebelled and refused to go back into the classroom. And we all had to stay inside for like 75% of this picnic day. We all got punished by staying inside. I mean, deservedly so. I mean, we were acting like, rebels.
I don't even remember that.
Yeah, most of my classmates would.
Yeah, I have no doubt that happened.
I want to draw this back into the book. And I'm wondering now, is this a J.K. Rowling? Are you gearing it toward, in writing it, were you gearing it toward middle school, 13, 14, 15-year-olds?
Did. Yeah, no, I knew that I wanted so kind of a rule of thumb is if your protagonist is the age of a middle schooler, then that's the age that it's meant for. And kids will read up, but they don't often read down in age. So I can get middle schoolers easily to read YA, which would have like a high school main character. But they're more hesitant to read a book, no matter how well it's written, with even like I teach 7th and 8th, 7th now, with even a 6th grade character. So I wanted to set it at a age level that I was most familiar with. And I love reading middle grade out of all of the ages. In fact, I hardly ever read adult literature at all. YA lands in my lap once in a while. Picture books will land in my lap once in a while, but it's mainly middle grade. And what surprised me, honestly, was the number of kids who were younger than the age that I was gearing this toward who started reading this. So one of my teachers at my school, her daughter is in 4th grade, and she started reading it. And she was like the first person to interact with me about this. And it was such a surreal experience, but so much fun. And they had ordered the book, and her mother had, the grandmother had read it first just to make sure it would be okay for somebody who was 9 essentially to read. And she's like, yes, but her mom, the teacher I work with, wanted to read it with her. And so they were reading a few chapters each night together. And then when she came in the next day to get it signed by me, her mom noticed that she had read ahead without her. And so, and she said she had to try to, she was trying to sneak it up into her room at night, to keep reading it and whatever. And so that was very awesome. I was excited about that. But, there's some hard things that happen in this story that are true. And it's a war story, obviously. And I tried to handle those with thoughtfulness so that it wasn't super distressing, but also impactful, because you're talking about loss of life and, connecting it to humans and families and the reality of what happens during war. I think is important for kids. There was a line in my novel where I wrote Vesna, the main character, saying, I wanted to be both truthful and protective. And that was a hard place to be. And I felt that when I was writing it as well. It's like, you need to tell the truth. And I'm a firm believer that students or kids, when they ask questions, you want to be truthful with them. You only need to tell them what they need to hear, what they're asking about, right? And so if they're ready for more, then they usually ask for more. But, I was conscientious of that when I was writing too. But it surprised me that kids as young as 9 were reading this, because I really thought it would be more of a, upper middle grade, 7th and 8th grade book.
Now, if you wanted to, a big thing in the publishing industry is if you can get a book onto a reading list at a school board, and we both know, especially at the university college level, that just grinds, because they're constantly updating their editions.
Yeah.
And every professor tells you, oh, you need this year's edition because I'm a contributing author.
Right.
Do you think there's any hope that you could get your book onto a reading list into the school libraries?
Oh, that would be awesome. Yeah, librarians and teachers are really the gatekeepers of what's going into kids' hands, especially middle grade, because they're not doing ordering themselves typically. If they see something in a bookstore that they are interested in, they'll pick it up. And, I do have kids who that's their excitement for the summer, is going to the bookstore, to pick up their summer reading list. And they'll explore looking by cover, right? So I knew the cover was going to be really important. I'm independently marketing it as an independently published person. And so my reach is somewhat limited in comparison to somebody who's being published by a publishing house. Even then, you have the lists that are sort of the books that are sort of mid-list books, and then you have books that are, getting most of the media attention and the publishing money. So I think it's challenging for all writers always. But yeah, I'd love to have my book out there in some regard, on a list. And I don't even know if they take independently published books for a lot of those lists, since I'm not the one that creates the lists. But
well, I don't know if you're familiar with the book. It's not. Have you heard of the Celestine Prophecy?
I have heard of it. I have not read it.
Okay, that was a self-published book by a gentleman out of one of the Carolinas, north or south, I don't recall.
Okay.
And it was published in the early 90s, very late 80s. So bookstores were very much around back then. Mm-hmm. And after he had Simon and Schuster, Penguin, he'd gone the rounds and they'd all rejected him. And so he self-published. Well, at that time, they used to call it vanity publishing. Yep. And he went out. And what he did was he went around to bookstores, independently owned bookstores, and would give them a free copy.
Okay.
And to encourage them to read it. And eventually, I believe the publisher was Simon and Schuster, who eventually picked it up. John Grisham, when his first novel was A Time to Kill, mm-hmm. and that was self-published.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, and I'm a bit of a bibliophobe, or whatever the term is. And John Grisham, when he wrote A Pelican Brief, that was picked up by a publishing house.
Okay.
And then what happened is people read Pelican Brief and said, "This is an amazing. Has this guy written anything else?"
Right. And then
then they discovered A Time to Kill, which had been self-published, that he sold out of the trunk of his car. So I point this out for our viewers, because there's a tendency to say, well, if it's not in the bookstore, if it doesn't have a publisher, there are some amazing books that are self-published. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the editing of it. Now, you mentioned, if you would, my short-term memory, I have a great memory, but it's very short. You referenced a gentleman who kind of guided you through the process. Or,
Yep, William Florence. Yep.
and what was the editing process like for you?
Well, as a teacher of English, this just kills me, but it makes me understand how this should be working for everyone. It doesn't matter how many times you go through the book. There are errors that are in there, and it's just almost impossible to get them all out. And I edit kids' writing all of the time. I can find errors easily. But when it comes to your own writing, you don't see them in the same way. And I think it's because you know what's going to be said coming up. And so you're skimming more. Like, you know how when you're reading a book and it doesn't matter how engrossing the book is, and you can have gone 3 or 4 pages and then wait a second, I'm totally thinking about something else. And I need to go reread all of that because I don't remember what I was reading. I think that same thing happens probably more with your own writing because you've been through it so many times. And so there's mistakes in this. Like, I just started rereading this. I'll never do this again. Published, because that's when you see everything. And I think it's just because it's in a different format.
Yes.
And especially because it's on paper. Whereas, I write exclusively on the computer now. I used to not be able to do that. I used to write on paper. I liked the sense of having the words sort of embedded into the paper. It felt permanent and, thoughtful and just part of the process. And then at some point I went, this is crazy. I can write much faster on the computer. And so started using the computer. And so I do think you see things less on the computer. That screen just doesn't, allow you to process things in the same way. But I read this. I had beta readers who read this. I had my uncle who read this. I do editing for him. And it's just like, I started going through this and I'm like, well, there is another error. And I was, got up to 6 of them. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to stop keeping track of this because it's just so frustrating. But it certainly emphasizes to me how we should not be paying attention to kids' errors in their writing all of the time. If they're going to be published or they're looking just even to publish within the classroom, you want it to be polished, right? But like, pointing out errors is not going to allow a child to grow, right? They need to be able to highlight and have highlighted what it is that they're doing so well in their writing so that they can continue to expand on that. I mean, I imagine like a basketball player and those poor professional players who still have trouble making a free throw, it's like, you should be able to do this. And yet their percentage isn't always that great on that. If somebody were to sit there and point out like every error that they were making every time, I think they would have, as a child, I think they would just stop. I don't know that they would keep doing it. So, my philosophy is celebrate kids writing as much as possible, point out what they're doing well. And so they can build upon that. They need to feel good about themselves as writers. And I think by the time they reach me in 7th and 8th grade, they are frustrated with writing because, it's always about make it perfect, look at the grammar part of it. And again, that's all important. And we should be focusing on that, but it can't be our primary focus. So yeah. So thanks for bringing up the errors that are in the book.
Did I do it in a reasonably decent
Oh
fashion?
yeah, no, I'm joking with you. I can laugh about this because it's just like, I know at this point that they're just not ever going to all go away. In fact, one of them even has some weird little symbol in there. And I'm like, I don't even know how I would have made that on the computer. Like, I don't think I made that. I think it is from transferring it from the document that I wrote into whatever I don't know enough about it, but I had somebody do that for me where they transfer it. Yeah. And I think it just automatically picked up something. I don't know. Anyway, it's fascinating. The whole process is fascinating.
One thing I wanted to ask, is it challenging in today's era to get students to read with the digital era, people on their cell phones, the media, you name it?
Yeah, I find it harder to read now, where I used to get lost in a book and just want to read all of the time. I am distracted by my phone and, more than I want to be. And I have to set it aside. Now, if I'm in a really, really engrossing book, I will read that book over everything else. And my process is to read for about a half an hour every night before I go to bed because it helps me to fall asleep. And so I consistently do that. But for students, their time is divided in so many different ways. And some of them are truly invested in reading and some of them are not. And some of them you can kind of catch and if you can get the right book into their hands, then they'll start reading. But kids do still read. I mean, I do a dog-eared book award with kids and we choose 10 books that we highlight for the year. And then we vote on the best cover and the best first chapter, read aloud, and then the best book overall. And a couple years ago, they were keeping track and their goal was to read 400 books by Christmas as a class. And they made that goal, they exceeded that goal. And I think they were well over 1,000 by the end of the year, which was amazing to me. But I will say the pandemic in the last 2 years, I believe has impacted kids more because they were at home and I don't think books were exchanging hands as easily as they would be if they were in a classroom. And they found themselves on their devices more and getting distracted by devices more. And so I think it's going to take a couple of years before we start to see that turn around a bit. It was more work this year for me to get kids to read during our silent reading period. We have a silent reading period right after lunch. And, they struggled with it more than they've ever struggled with it. So I think that it's just going to take them a couple years to rediscover what books can give to them. But yeah, it's hard.
I'm curious. I'm sure when you get a breakdown from Amazon, people ordering your book, what's the breakdown in terms of tangible, hard, actual real book and Kindle or whatever?
Yeah, mostly paperbacks, mostly the paper copy. There have been some of the digital versions, and that's interesting because it'll even track how many pages that people will read, and you can get paid by the number of pages that are read in the book versus just the purchase of the book. I mean, there's all kinds of little nuanced things, but the majority of people are buying a paperback.
Okay.
Which I'm glad to see. I like to see books in kids' hands. So.
Same here.
Yeah.
I've honestly never read a book on electronically.
Yeah.
There's just something about having the physical book. I don't need a battery.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's cumbersome. I feel like even if you're reading it on a small, like a Kindle or something, I find it a little more cumbersome to just manage and hold on to. But yeah, I know that there's some people who love them. I do a lot of reading of books on the computer simply because I get some ARC copies, which are advanced reader copies. I belong to a book group called Book Sojourn, and we look at all of the ARC, well, not all of the ARCs, but we look at lots of ARCs ahead of time, and then we'll write reviews and pass them to each other. And so there was a shift a few years ago towards putting more of those on ARC, on e-copies, e-ARCs. And so, and when I do editing for other people, that's always on the computer too. So for me to have a book in my hand, that's just a gift. It really is. I just love the process of that, the feel of the pages and the cover and all of it. So.
I used to be a bit of a book nerd. When I would get a paperback book, I would immediately take cellophane tape and go around the edges of it
to make sure
to protect the cover.
Yeah.
And because I'm cheap, so I always bought I went to a used bookstore where you could turn the books back in after you've read them.
Yeah.
And Sue, who owned the store, used to call me a book snob because I never turned my books back in. I liked them to be a trophy on the wall. See that book?
Sure. Yeah.
John Grisham, Michael Harris, Dostoevsky, Thackeray. I read them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I keep track of all of my books on a Pinterest page, and so then kids can go there to look for books as well that I have read. So it helps me to remember, because again, so many books going in and out of my hands all the time. It helps me to remember what I've read. So
have authors go through a number of things to now self-publishing is becoming an industry.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things authors have done, have you considered going to book fairs or to community events? Sometimes there'll be a county fair, things of that nature. You'll often see self-published authors
Yeah. Yeah. So I did not too long ago, the high school that I graduated from had an alumni breakfast. And so I went and sold books there after the breakfast, which was a lot of fun because it enabled me to connect to some people I hadn't seen in years, like, from 40 years ago. So that was a lot of fun. And yeah, I during the school year, it's really challenging to do anything besides teach. And so the book came out in January at the very beginning of the year. And so there were just so many things that were happening. And I kept saying, if I can get through this, if I can get through this, plus I'm still trying to write. And so it's a balance, right? Between it's always a time thing, I feel. And, eventually I'm just settling into summer. We just started, like, this is my second week of summer break. And so my brain is starting to get creative again. And once that happens, then then I'll start to put some things together. But yeah, I'm doing a presentation for MANS, which is the Michigan Area Non-Public Schools, in November. I'm supposed to be going out to the National Council of Teachers of English, NCTE, and doing a presentation there also in November, and at their national convention. And so, those are two big things I have on my radar. I'm doing this with you, which I absolutely love.
As are we.
Yeah,
Good.
I mean, we really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to come on. You're such an inspiring guest.
Well, I will be honest with you, I had to fight the urge to not do this because I don't like speaking in front of people. And even though it's just the two of you, it still feels like it's in front of people. I know it's weird. I went into teaching, right? But it's like, I don't know how that happened, but I loved teaching so much. I loved learning so much that I just did that. So I had to keep convincing myself that this would be okay, which it is. It's totally great.
It's outstanding. Yeah.
You have I used to be military and every industry loves its acronyms, and you've thrown out plenty of them. Thankfully, you've said after each one, you've said what it stands for. But one you didn't, and I should know it, but I don't, because you're referring to the market you're targeting with the book, YA.
Oh, YA, that's young adults.
Young adults, okay.
Yes,
I was going to say young adolescents, youth, and what?
That's like the high school age main character. And then for a while, they were kind of playing around with a new adult, an NA market. And I really think that is a market, but I don't know that enough people were landing in it. There are some really good books that have older teenagers who would be about college age, and their experiences would be totally different from what a high schooler's experience would be. And so they were marketing those as a new adult. And I think that's kind of sort of stopped. I don't know. Or if there's just not a lot of people pushing that, I don't know. But the books that I read that were in that age level were really, really good.
Well, just before, or just at the start, right around the start of this pandemic, I think it was in October of 2020, so we'd had it for some time. I picked up a book called The Boy Who Dared, which sounds somewhat reminiscent of what you're writing about. I don't know whether you're familiar with it.
I am, and I'm trying to think. I want to make sure it's the one I'm thinking of. So I'm just going to.
It's about a young lad growing up in Nazi Germany who later starts dropping leaflets.
Yes. I have a copy of it in my library, so I have read it in my classroom library. It's been a while since I've read that one.
But as as a soon-to-be 56-year-old man, I guess I read it when I was 54. It was an outstanding book. Maybe it's a YA book, but I don't think, and the subject matter you're dealing with here, which is in Yugoslavia during the Nazi era, and Yugoslavia was very much in the crosshairs. After the war ended, I mean, even before the war started, it's such a volatile part of the world where there have been conflicts going back for thousands of years based on language, religion, economy, everything.
Yeah, well, for sure. So a couple of things in there. I think a good book will appeal to readers no matter the age. So when you're reading The Boy Who Dared and enjoying it, that should be as it is, because it's a good story. Um, Picture books really aren't children's picture books. They're books for anyone, right? They're told just in a different format. So that's that. The idea of everything going on in Yugoslavia. And I think what surprised me, well, maybe not surprised me the most, but what I was emphasized to me was how much an enemy tries to take away the culture of a people. And we see that happening now, like even with the situation in Ukraine. I mean, this book came out about the time that right before the war in Ukraine started. And it was just devastating to me to see what was going to happen and was happening to the people of Ukraine, and how their culture is trying, the Russians are trying to destroy their culture. And that came through, the stories of when the dad was talking with other adults, and they were saying how a priest had been killed because he refused to stop singing in his native language. And then one of the children later encounters a soldier who spits on him because he was speaking his own language. There's just this sense of taking away humanity and who someone is that happens with war. And it's devastating. I mean, it really is, to have all the losses of the buildings and beyond just the people. I mean, the loss of people can't possibly be replaced. Buildings can be rebuilt, but they're not going to be the same, right? Families can be rebuilt, but the people are never going to be replaced. And, it's just devastating. I think it's important for kids to read about war and in any topic, really, so that they know what should not be happening, right? They need to find the humanity in people and focus on the care that they have for people. This book, I really tried to show what it was like to be a child and sort of the I don't want to say whimsical, because there were, it's a war story, so there's not really a lot of whimsy that was happening, but even Vesna watching her younger sister, twirl around outside the barn doors in the sunlight. I tried to have little moments of that seemed like a normal childhood moment, even within the war that was taking place. Because I think that making sure we're human and we think of each other as humans as much as possible is important.
Well, I found a commonality with The Boy Who Dared in that, and I forget the name of the principal character in The Boy Who Dared, but this young lad is growing up, he's in grade 7 or 8 when Hitler rises to power. And people forget that, the Nazis came to power in 1933. There was over 6 years before they invaded Poland and World War II started. And your book speaks to this as well. There are individuals who are kind of just they're not willing to put a foot down in any one particular camp.
Yeah.
And it's even more dynamic in your book because, there it was either you're with the Nazis or not with the Nazis.
Yeah.
You kind of had 2 choices. And in Yugoslavia, there were communist elements, Croatian elements, Nazi elements, and I think I'm even leaving out some elements.
Yeah. I know the father in the book, I had him struggling with how much to do, and part of that was because there was safety in not making choices, I think, but also wanting to keep family safe. And so the older brother who goes off to war made a choice, and the father didn't really want him doing that and said, you don't know what this is going to be like because you've heard stories but you haven't experienced it, and I don't think unless you're living through something, whatever it is, that you're fully experiencing it. So hopefully books will get kids curious, and then they'll explore more, and hopefully it makes them more aware of what's happening, and so they can be conscientious when things in their own lives, in their own countries, start to go in a direction that they don't want them to go. I think it's all about being informed, right? And so the more information you have, the better your choices can be. So yeah, Vesna, the main character, she just wants the information all the time. She feels like she's being protected, looked at as a child, not being told what's going on. And she wants to know what's going on because it's happening around her. And I think in a war, it would be impossible to keep kids entirely sheltered. We as adults will try as much as possible to protect kids, but they're aware, and they're much more aware than we ever think they are. So.
Oh, very good. Well, I've asked just about every question I question I had planned, and then 5 or 6 more came up while we were talking because you're such an engaging speaker.
One thing I would like to ask is, what does the future hold for you as far as teaching and also writing?
Well, I'm still teaching, and I can't imagine life without teaching in some way. So I imagine I'll be teaching for a while. I'm currently working on a middle grade book that is told in verse. Poetry is always where my heart is, and I write on online with an online group every month. And during the month of April, we write for 30 straight days, which is a lot of writing. That's a big commitment, but it's so good. It's such a great community. And so this book is set in Michigan, and it's historical fiction again, and is loosely about a girl who really wants to be involved with what were considered the surfmen, the first Coast Guard members. And, she can't obviously because she's female, but I don't know all the directions that this is going in. It's just kind of fleshing itself out right now. I really need to get up north and do some research. And then, but again, it's just the beginning of summer. So I'm like, okay, I've got to figure all this out and get my brain cooking on creative stuff. So.
And we've had so many iconic guests from Michigan, but we've never really asked, what do you like best about Michigan? What kept you living there all these years?
Well, I never really thought about moving away. Although every once in a while I'll think about like moving to Ireland or overseas or something,
Sure.
That would be cool. But I love the water. I love being surrounded by water. Lake Michigan is the most beautiful lake. And I think it rivals some of the bodies of water in Greece and anywhere else that, when you're looking at it, just absolutely.
Lake Ontario. I'm sorry, Jennifer. Lake Ontario tops Lake Michigan. Okay.
Oh, it probably, I need to spend more time there. I haven't spent a lot of time in Lake Ontario. So yeah.
I'm being facetious.
No, I know. Okay. I don't know. I honestly don't know that much about it other than just when we've traveled along it. So, because we drove through Ontario frequently when we were heading out east when I was little. So it kind of was just a long car ride more than anything else, but.
A long, boring car ride.
Yeah.
Ontario is, once you get out of Toronto and you get about maybe half an hour, 45 minutes east, you're just driving along a strip of road with trees on either side with nothing to look at.
My parents moved to Vermont about 20 years ago and lived there for about 10 years. And so we drove that back and forth quite a bit. And yeah, it's a long drive. Yeah.
And a long, boring drive.
I don't mind those car rides. I used to read all the time when I was little. That's what I would do. I'd sit in the back and just read books the whole entire time we drove. So
I'll do my bit for the Canadian and Ontario Tourist Board. If you want to go traveling in Ontario, the best trip is to go from Sudbury to Sault Ste. Marie, because you're going up and around the north shore of Lake Superior.
Okay.
And the views are absolutely breathtaking and spectacular.
Okay, that's good to know. I've wanted to go to the Georgian Bay area. We've looked at that a lot. It looks like it's gorgeous there as well. So,
yeah. Well, there we did our plug for the Ontario Tourist Board.
That's good.
And for Michigan.
And for Michigan.
Well, we really appreciate you coming on, Jennifer. We will post the link to Amazon where you can get your book at. Thanks so much. You've made such an impact on my life, on countless others' lives.
Well, thank you. It's been great to connect with you again. And to meet you.
Yeah.